Theodore. He's a tugboat and a friendly tugboat too. A friendly tugboat too. Oh, Theodore likes to do the things that friendly tugboats do. Pushing and a pulling in the great big harbor, in the great big world is so much fun. So many brand new things to discover. Waking with the sun, gotta get the job done. Oh, Theodore and Emily, Theodore, Hank and George, and the harbor master too.
The old town clock on Citadel Hill told midnight. Somewhere, a lone Canada goose cried its haunting cry, flying south ahead of the icy winds of winter. The tugs were sound asleep at the great Ocean Tug and Salvage Company dock. The water was getting chillier, and they'd snuggled together for warmth. Something was gurgling. It was gurgling under the inky sea. Gurgling at first, and then it was bubbling, and from the bubbling began a foaming, which at last became a swirling of something moving towards Theodore. Closer and faster, and from the water came a sea monster. A sea monster roared up from the dampy deep. Oh, it had bugly eyes and big batty wings to carry a tug down to its sea monster lair, far, far beneath the waves. Theodore gasped out loud, and it woke up Emily. Sea monster! Shivered Theodore. It had bugly eyes and batty wings and oh.
What the is that? It's not like I wanted to sleep or anything. Good luck with this in your nightmares for the next few weeks.
Well, that certainly is a looker, I'll give it that. Although those big doofy eyes don't help. But the teeth did add some level of threat. But based on the coloring of the scene, it looks like it's just a dream, which is exactly what Theodore was doing. Even though he didn't think so, he tried telling Emily who he accidentally woke up.
It was only a dream, Theodore, she said. A dream? Repeated Theodore. Dreams aren't real, answered Emily, like when we pretend about pirates. Well, said Theodore, we never see pirates, but I did see this sea monster, right there. I don't think sea monsters are real, said Emily. You could get Theodore to ask his friends at the Oceanic Institute if there are any sea monsters, she said, trying to be helpful. Theodore decided he would ask Theodore in the morning. But that night, he couldn't get to sleep. He was sure the sea monster was out there, and he was sure it would come again. Just then, Theodore heard an odd sound. He saw that George was giggling, but he was fast asleep. Now, wasn't that strange? Theodore thought.
George. Tough tug George, giggling in his sleep. That's an odd trait. What wasn't odd, though, was when Theodore and Theodore confirmed with Rebecca that the Big Harbor was sea monster free. So instead, the two tugs decided to get creative.
Later that same day, a hammering and a clattering and even a crashing sound could be heard coming from the great Ocean Tug and Salvage Company dock. Theodore came by, towing a big snaky piece of driftwood beside him. "How's this?" he called to Theodore, who was floating beside an old fishing net with pieces of seashells and empty tin cans and other bits and things hanging from it. Theodore studied Theodore's driftwood carefully. "Just what we need for our monster trap," he declared at last. "Also, I found an old fishing net. Now that will catch it for sure." Later, Hank appeared. He stared at Theodore's sea monster trap, because it certainly looked very impressive. "What will you do when you catch the sea monster?" he asked. "Will you keep it, Theodore?" Now that was something Theodore hadn't thought of. Having a sea monster around all the time would be terrible. "Sea monsters are quite clever," said Theodore. "So it won't actually come into the trap, but it will scare it away," added Theodore hopefully.
Oh, Hank, always thinking outside the box in ways no one else does. I am a little confused, though, as to how this sea monster trap would work. Is it triggered by movement, or something else?
Well, my question is, how the hell did Theodore build that trap? Sure, we all hear the noise from the dock, But duh, obviously they don't have any arms. So how does this actually work? Doesn't this violate some kind of physics rule?
Well, I'm not even sure if Theodore knows, but the test came when he fell asleep later that night.
Theodore settled into his place at the dock beside his sea monster trap. At midnight, the hour of deepest darkness, there came a gurgling sound from the very deepest, darkest depths of the harbor. First a gurgling, and then a bubbling, and finally a foaming was seen. And from that foaming came a swirling, and from a swirling, something rising. It was rising, and it was rising, it was rising from the water. And from the water came the monster, and from its mouth an anchor dangling, for on a tug it had been dining. Then a voice began calling for him, calling, Theodore, 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 wake up! It was Emily. She was calling his name and nudging him awake. Well, Theodore looked fearfully around for the sea monster, but it had disappeared again.
Yes, this is because you're dreaming. Come on, Theodore, this can't be the first time you're experiencing a nightmare this bad. Unfortunately, it influenced him so not to get very good sleep. He had trouble that night, and it affected his work the next day.
I must get the wheat to the grain elevators, Theodore said to himself slowly. He was very, very tired. He hadn't been able to sleep on account of the sea monster. He wished he could have a little nap right then and there. Theodore's eyes began to get heavy, as if he was going to go to sleep. Theodore, mind your course. It was Petra, the pilot boat. Theodore saw that his end of the ship was heading right towards my office. Quickly, he set himself right and apologized to Gloria. Oh, sorry, Gloria. But soon, Theodore's eyelids felt like they had little anchors on their ends, pulling them down. And he began drifting off again. Theodore drifted right into the ship and gave her a big bump. Oh, sorry, Gloria. He apologized again.
How many of us have been in Theodore's place here? You know, nodding off while you're doing work after being stressed over whatever is bothering you? I can relate for sure, and believe me, it ain't fun.
Yikes. Work performance is key, Theodore. Petra, the pilot boat, spoke to Theodore later to make sure he was okay. Emily noticed how distraught Theodore was and offered to stay awake and watch out for this creature. Sadly, she couldn't even stay awake on Theodore's behalf.
But as the old town clock tolled midnight, Emily grew sleepy. And by the last toll of midnight, she was snoring. After the snoring came a gurgling sound, and then a foaming. A foaming on the sea was growing, until finally there was a swirling, and then the monster came a-calling. Its eyes were wide as whale pies, and it had a long green glowy tail, which was really the scariest sight of all. Theodore blasted his horn. The blast woke up Emily. Sea monster! He cried. Didn't you see it? He asked Emily. But Emily had to admit that she'd fallen asleep. I may as well move to another harbor, said Theodore, because I'll never sleep here again. And that means I'll never work or go out on the ocean.
What's with this sea monster Theodore keeps dreaming about? Every time it appears, it gets more and more features.
There's two things I see wrong here. First off, the fact that Theodore has blown his whistle 2 times now and somehow manages to only wake up Emily is bizarre. You're gonna tell me that the dispatcher and other tugs don't physically hear him screaming? I find that very hard to believe. Not only that, what makes Theodore so sure that moving to a new harbor will solve his problem? Theodore, listen. Changing your location does not help you sleep better. Believe me, I know what I'm talking about. But in any case, it is strange to see how much the sea monster keeps getting more frightening every time.
What kind of oil is Theodore taking? He needs to take the one George was taking, since they both noticed him giggling again. So Emily decided to ask him the next morning.
Emily, who had been thinking, turned to George and said, "George, why were you giggling in your sleep last night?" "I was," said George, quite surprised. "Oh," he said. "Oh, that was the waltzing Sugar Plum Harbor fairies. Oh, every night they come and dance around the dock. They're funny."
I'm sorry. What? Did I hear you correctly, George?
Sugar Plum Fairies? Okay, this is weird from a George character perspective. How could tough big boy Tug George dream about waltzing Sugar Plum Harbor fairies? He didn't even say it like he was making it up. He said it like it was true. What a bizarre interest of his. So the next night, Emily and Theodore wanted to prove what George said was true.
"It looks like George's fairies have come," Emily whispered. Theodore looked and looked, but he couldn't see any waltzing Sugar Plum Harbor fairies. Not a one. He was certain they would come because George said he saw them, and George always told the truth. So he kept on looking. But after a really good look, he said, "I don't see any fairies." "But George does," said Emily quietly. Then Theodore knew. He knew that George's fairies would not come that night, and he knew something else. He knew his sea monster wouldn't come either. It was just a dream, too, just like Emily had said. "Sweet dreams, Theodore," said Emily with a smile in her voice. Theodore was already fast asleep. He was so tired of not having slept in days and days. Soon he was snoring. And after the snoring, there came a giggling.
And that concludes Theodore's Bad Dreams. Alright, Nick, what are your thoughts on this episode?
In the Dark and Scary Cove episode, it was verbally mentioned that Theodore had a bad dream about the particular location. However, in this story's defense, the nightmare here had a visual depiction and was probably more terrifying than just a dark cove. The sea monster to this episode was goofy looking, but still showed some kind of danger, being that it appeared 3 times and each time it got more and more elaborate. It's also true, though, about dreams in general. They are just manifestations of what our brains conjure up when we go to bed, and sometimes we can't control how and what things appear. It was also nice to have the introduction of Rebecca. She and Foduk attempted to ground the scenario by providing facts and logic. Obviously, the thing that convinced Theodore was George's waltzing Sugar Plum Harbor fairies, which is by far the silliest thing he's ever admitted to wholeheartedly, which is so odd because George is all about being rough, tough, gruff, and buff. So how come he can let down his ego for that? I don't know. Apparently admitting to this is a no biggie for him. As for visuals, the sleepy face mask for Theodore was pretty cool. That definitely made him look drowsy. The film crew also gave the Tugs closed eyes when they slept this time. How accurate. Then there was also the dream sequences involving the bubbling and swirling water. I'm sure the crew for that just used dry ice to cause the effect. Simple and easy. Lastly, Graham Shaw's music for this was unique. Here he incorporated strings that fit the bill of the horror genre, whenever the sea monster rose from the surface. Overall, it's an okay episode, and it explains a little bit about dreams.
I do have to admit that when I first saw this episode back in 2012, I was terrified. Between the creepy music and the sea monster itself, oh yeah, I had a tough time getting that thing out of my head. However, I'm sure that a lot of us can relate to Theodore here, as we've all dealt with bad dreams before. And as Nick pointed out, these manifestations are conjured up by whatever is on our minds, more commonly due to something like stress or whatever. Which leads me into another question. What could have possibly been on Theodore's mind to make him dream up something like this? And while technically this isn't the first time he's had a bad dream, this gets me thinking, maybe somehow this episode comes before the Dark and Scary Cove? It only makes the most logical sense, don't you think? Getting back on track here, the most unique things about this episode were definitely the creepy dream atmosphere, the sea monster model, and Graham Shaw's incredible horror bits. Pretty cool to see the crew use, I'm guessing, dry ice for all the foaming effects. Don't know how they came up with this thing, but while it looks very dangerous looking, the sea monster itself is horrible, but in a good way. And I applaud Graham once again for giving us a spine chiller. It really gave the audience a sense that Theodore could be potentially in danger even though he's just dreaming. These three key things totally make the episode one of the best Season 1 has to offer. I would definitely check this out for those who haven't seen it. Up next is Theodore Buttons On.